Hello, Year 9. This is Mrs. Doughty again. Haven't been with you for a few weeks now, but we've had lessons from the lovely Miss Henderson and lovely Mrs. Maloney. So this is Mrs. Doughty coming at you from the bustling metropolis that is Binstead. And this particular morning is a grey, dull morning, so I hope by the time you read this lesson that the weather has improved a little bit. Okay, so we're in Romeo and Juliet. Lesson 10, Wherefore art thou? I feel a heavy weight of responsibility teaching this lesson because this scene is possibly one of the most, if not the most famous in English literature and certainly in dramatic history. This scene is potentially just massive. So it's really important that you gain a really strong understanding of this scene. Okay, so you will need a pen and paper if you have it, or something to jot on. It's not essential, but if you had it, it might help. And you do need your student pack that was posted to you for today. Okay, all the reading is on the PowerPoint, so there's no need to print anything extra out. I've put all the extracts and everything on here. It may mean there's quite a lot of reading, so it may mean that you'll want to pause and start again more frequently than usual, but everything is here if you need it. Okay. So the first question that I'm going to ask you today is, how would you describe Juliet when she was talking with her mother and the nurse? Now, I must admit, the nurse is one of my favorite characters in literature. I just think she's funny, bawdy, as we'd call it, B-A-W-D-Y. She's hilarious, that character. Absolutely love her. And how would you describe Juliet when she was talking with Romeo for the first time? Is Juliet the same Juliet when she talks to her mother and the nurse as the Juliet that we see when she meets Romeo for the first time? Does she seem different in each scene? What do you think? So pause here and write a few notes on each scene. So you may have noticed that in the first scene, when Juliet is dealing with her mother and her nurse, she learns of Paris's proposal and she's meek and obedient. She wants to please her mother and do what her mother says. But when we meet Romeo, Juliet forgot her promise to her mother. She certainly does not seek to love Paris. She kisses and flirts with Romeo, cheeky, and she acts in a very different way. She becomes kind of little Miss Flirt a little bit. But can you blame her? She's 13. Okay, so I've divided this lesson into two parts because I think it's quite long, so you might need a break at the end of part one. So yeah, if you need a break, that's fine. I'll tell you when we come to it, when is a good time for you to pause and have a break, okay? So Romeo and Juliet have met at the Capulet masked ball. They have discovered who each other is. They're madly, deeply already in love at first sight. And Romeo decides that he doesn't want to leave the party. So I'll read this slide to you. Romeo has left the party before he is caught by the Capulets, but he has just met Juliet and he can't bear to leave the property just yet. Romeo is in Capulet's orchard, talking to himself about Juliet's beauty. If you don't know what an orchard is, it's a field with, or a garden with lots of fruit trees. So yeah, Romeo just thought he would pop himself into the garden and hang out where no one knew where he was and keep a lookout for Juliet. Now, in this garden, he says a soliloquy. So you may remember what a soliloquy is from last year. In the image below, Romeo is making a soliloquy. What is a soliloquy? See if you can remember. A soliloquy is a speech in a play where the character speaks to himself or herself or to the people watching rather than to the other characters. It means they can be totally honest and say what they are truly thinking and feeling. A soliloquy is a little bit like if you have a bit of a rant or speech in your head. But of course, if you're on stage and you are a writer and you want to show the inner workings of somebody's mind or their thought process, You can do that to a point through stage directions, but also they devise this way, playwrights devise this way of writing a soliloquy, which is a speech that they speak to him or herself or to the people watching rather than to other characters. And it means that they can be themselves. In Romeo's soliloquy, he compares Juliet's beauty to that of the sun, brighter than the stars, as glorious as an angel. Halfway through, Juliet appears at her balcony, but she doesn't know that Romeo is in the orchard below. After Juliet appears, Romeo continues to observe her. I'm going to read this scene to you, and you can hear. I often wonder, I'm going to miss the discussion part of this lesson because reading this with students always comes up with really interesting opinions about what they think about Romeo at this point. So if you thought someone was beautiful or very handsome, how would you tell them? How would you talk about them? And then how would you tell them? So you fancy someone, you see them in your year 9 bubble, right? And you think, oh, they're attractive, right? What would you start perhaps saying about them? What do people who are your age nowadays say about someone when they fancy them or they think they're attractive? And then let's compare that to how Romeo talks about Juliet in this scene. Okay, so he says, now you don't have this in your packs, I don't think. So it's all on the screen in front of you. I'm going to do it slowly. And I've highlighted the text as I read it so you can see, and I'm going to explain it as we go. So it would be completely acceptable for you to stop and restart and rewind and replay this so that you can really understand exactly what's going on. Remember, Romeo's in Juliet's garden, looking up at her, and he says, but soft, through yonder window breaks, which basically means what light is coming through that window over there. Presumably Juliet comes out of her room and he sees it and he says, it is the east, and Juliet is the is fair and the envious moon, who is sick and pale with grief, that thou, her maid, art far more fair than she. So in this so far, Juliet is seen as the sun by Romeo, and he's telling the sun to arise and kill the moon because the moon is envious. It's sick and pale with grief. I have a picture. Oh, I made it come to you a little bit too late, but basically he says, arise, fair sun, and kill the envious moon, who is already sick and pale with grief, that thou, her maid, art far more fair than she. Be not her maid, since she is envious. Her vestal livery is but sick and green. Vestal livery refers to clothing. So if you look at the picture there, that's the goddess Diana, who is the goddess of the moon. And here Romeo is basically saying that Juliet shouldn't be a follower of the moon or a lover of the moon. She should not serve the goddess of the moon, and she should shine in her own right, essentially like a goddess. And he's basically saying that the moon is sick and green with jealousy. Okay. He says, none but fools do wear it. So only fools would wear the colors of the moon, right? Only fools would identify with the moon. He says, cast it off. He's saying, cast it off. Don't follow the moon. You are like the sun, and you're making the moon jealous, basically. And then he says, my lady, it is love. Oh, that she knew she were. So she can't hear him at this stage. And he's kind of standing underneath the balcony and explaining that he sees her or perceives her as more beautiful than the moon, and the moon is getting jealous of Juliet. She speaks, yet she says nothing. What of that? So one might wonder here, well, how is she speaking if she's not saying? And he says her eye discourses, which means her eyes are speaking for her. And then he says, I will answer it. He goes, no, I'm too bold. Not to me, she speaks. So therefore, he's saying, he's kind of deciding, I'm going to go for it. I'm going to tell her I'm here. And then he doubts himself and thinks, no, 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 I better not. I'm too bold, right? She's not really talking to me. She doesn't know I'm here. But he does say that in her eye, he sees something that she's, and he calls these the two of the fairest stars in all the heaven, having some business. So he says her eyes, Romeo says Juliet's eyes, are two of the fairest stars in heaven. Having some business, they do entreat her eyes to twinkle in their spheres till they return. So basically he's saying that stars in heaven are asking Juliet to lend her eyes to twinkle in their place. So they're going to come down to earth, the stars, two of them, and instead Juliet's eyes will twinkle in their place. He says, what if her eyes were there, they in her head? So he's saying that the stars could switch places with Juliet's eyes, they twinkle so bright. The brightness of her cheek would shame those stars, as daylight doth a lamp. So now he's saying that not only are her eyes beautiful, her cheeks are bright and beautiful, so much so that they would shame the stars in the same way that daylight is brighter than stars. Her eyes are brighter than stars as well. Her eyes in heaven would through the airy region stream so bright that birds would sing and think it were not night. See how she leans her cheek upon her hand. Oh, that I were a glove upon that hand, that I might touch that cheek. So he's saying he wishes that he were gloves that Juliet was wearing, because then he could touch her. Because then he could touch her cheek, because she's got her hand on her cheek. And she's kind of really listless at the moment. She's in a daydreamy kind of mood, and she says, ah, me. And then again, Romeo says, she speaks. Oh is an interjection, a big explosion of emotion. Speaking right angel. So he hears her voice kind of sighing in the distance, and then he's still talking to himself at this point, but he says, oh, speak again, bright angel, for thou art glorious to this night. And in this next section here, he compares her to a winged messenger of heaven, which presumably is an angel. That men can see when they look up at the sky. So he says, being o'er is a winged messenger of heaven, upturned wondering eyes, of mortals that fall back to gaze on him when he bestrides the lazy pacing clouds and sails upon the bosom of the air. So basically he's saying, oh, when angels, because that happens all the time, when angels come down from heaven and cavort amongst the clouds, that's what you're like to me, Juliet. Okay? Okay, so in this passage we've just read, Romeo exaggerates how beautiful Juliet is. He makes it sound like nothing is as beautiful as Juliet, and Juliet is the most beautiful thing in the universe. He's very over the top. So if you think back to the original question I said of what would you say about someone, how would you express if you thought that he or she was beautiful? How does it compare? Have you ever told someone that their eyes twinkle like the stars in the sky? Okay, maybe. Try it. Try it someday. Advice for love from Mrs. Doughty. Or not from Mrs. Doughty, from Shakespeare. Okay, so let's look in detail now at these lines and really look at how Romeo exaggerates Juliet's beauty. So he says, her eyes are two of the fairest stars in all the heaven, having some business, do entreat her eyes to twinkle in their spheres till they return. What if her eyes were there, they in her head? So what if her eyes were up in the sky, and what if the stars were in her head? Even those stars would be shamed, those stars in Juliet's face, in her eyes, would be shamed, by the brightness of her cheek. Her eyes in heaven would through the airy region stream so bright that birds would sing and think it were not night. So her eyes up in heaven would light up the world so much that birds would get confused and birds would think that it was daytime when it was actually nighttime. And then he says, oh, see how she leans her cheek upon her hand. Oh, that I were a glove upon that hand, that I may touch her cheek. So find two examples of Romeo in exaggerating Juliet's beauty. Okay, so I have explained it to you. You can pause it here and make a note of this, okay? Two examples of Romeo exaggerating Juliet's beauty. So hopefully you did pause it, and hopefully you found something like this. He says, Juliet's eyes are the fairest stars in all of heaven. The brightness of Juliet's cheek would shame those stars, as daylight doth a lamp. And Juliet's eyes are so bright that birds would sing and think it were not night. Now you may be noticing my tone here. I might be sounding like I'm thinking he's being a bit silly here, but that's part of the charm of Romeo and Juliet, especially as an adult reading it, is you see these two young people completely head over heels for each other. And maybe they're using language that, you know, is not modern language, but certainly the sentiment is the same. Young people, people of all ages, do very silly things for love, right? So I don't think much has changed in that way anyway. Okay, so the technical term for exaggeration is hyperbole. Hyperbole. So you'll see it in bold there at the top. It's not hyperbole, hyperbole. Okay, hyperbole. Juliet's eyes are the fairest stars in all the heaven. The brightness of Juliet's cheek would shame those stars, as daylight doth a lamp. And Juliet's eyes are so bright that birds would sing and think it were not night. So which of these examples are hyperbole? These ones in the box, not the ones we just looked at, okay? All of the ones in green are hyperbole. They're all exaggeration. Of course, her eyes are not going to shine as bright as stars. Of course, her cheek is not so bright that they would make stars feel ashamed, for many reasons. And Juliet's eyes are not so bright that birds would forget that it's nighttime and sing as though it were day, okay? But in this white box here, which of these are examples of hyperbole? 1. Not even the deepest ocean in the world would have enough water to wash the stain from my hands. 2. He is really rich. In fact, I would guess that he's the richest person I know. Or 3. When I called the teacher Mom, I thought that I would die of embarrassment. That's a true story, by the way. Happens all the time. So there's two of these three that are examples of hyperbole. See if you can pause, if you need to, and guess which of these, or identify which of these three is an example of hyperbole. If you guessed 1 and 3, ding, 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 you're right. Not even the deepest ocean in the world would have enough water to wash the stain from my hands. Now, I don't know if you can guess what Shakespeare play that's from. It's one that we study for GCSE. And if you could guess Macbeth, you would also be right. Then number 3, when I called the teacher Mom, I thought that I would die of embarrassment. Of course, you're not going to really die from being embarrassed. You might be really embarrassed, but you're not going to die from it. Romeo's use of hyperbole doesn't just show how beautiful he finds Juliet, it also reveals something about his character. And you may already have judgments about that, whilst you know how he sulked and wrote poetry for Rosalind, and how when we first met Romeo, he was writing poetry for another woman, right? 24 hours before this, he was head over heels for Rosalind, goes to the ball, and sees Juliet, and then all of a sudden his universe has tilted on its axis. So what kind of person is like that is so easily changed from being, you know, what he thinks is quite deep in love, but then when he sees Juliet, he says, did my heart love till now? So clearly what he feels for Juliet has hit him harder. Sure. But what kind of character is he? So think about this answer to this question. Does Romeo have a realistic attitude to Juliet in his relationship with her and his relationship with her? So remember, these are quotations for what he says about her that we'd like you to remember. This is the third time I've mentioned them. So her eyes are the fairest stars in heaven, her cheek would shame those stars, and her eyes are so bright that birds would sing and think it were not night. What I'd like you to do is write an answer to this question. Does Romeo have a realistic attitude to Juliet and his relationship with her? So you can pause the video now and write a response. Now, how long your response is going to depend on how well you've learned the material so far. So you may have quite a lot to say, or you may have just a short and sweet response of a couple of sentences. So pause the video here, reread these 3 quotations, and then answer the question, does Romeo have a realistic attitude to Juliet and his relationship with her? And then restart the video. So this is part 2, where we look in a little bit more depth at Juliet's fatal flaw. Now, some of you may have taken quite a long time to answer that last question. So if you need a break, this is a good time to pause the video and then come back. But if not, you can push through, and the second half takes about the same length as the first, okay? So there's Juliet and the famous line, "Wherefore art thou Romeo?" We're going to look at her side now of this scene. So shortly after this point, Juliet also makes a soliloquy. Even though Romeo is listening, she doesn't know this. She talks as if she were completely alone. Let's read Juliet's thoughts on her meeting with Romeo. So we're going to read this together. And just before we start, it should be clear to you that wherefore means why. So when she says, "Wherefore art thou Romeo?" she's not asking where he is. She's asking, why is he Romeo Montague? "O Romeo, wherefore art thou Romeo? Deny thy father, and refuse thy name, or, if thou wilt not, be sworn my love, and I'll no longer be a captive." So basically, she's asking here, why are you a Romeo? And then when she says, "Deny thy father and refuse thy name," your teacher, if you were in class, would probably ask you, what does deny mean? What does refuse mean? And of course, you'd come up with the response through discussion that really she's asking him, in a sense, to disown his family, or at least disown their family name. And then she says, "But if you won't, don't worry, because if you swear your love to me, I'll no longer be a Capulet." So she's very, as they are, keenly aware of the feud between their families. And she's already seeing this obstacle that he's a Montague, she's a Capulet, and therefore they can't be together. Okay? So Romeo aside and says, "Shall I hear more, or shall I speak at this?" So perhaps he's feeling a bit guilty listening in on her speech where she thinks she's alone. But he doesn't speak. He decides to remain quiet and let her speak. And she says, "'Tis but thy name that is mine enemy. Thou art thyself a Montague." So basically here she's saying, it's not you that's my enemy, it's your name. And there's merit to that, isn't there? Right? If we had a different name, would we be a different person? Juliet would argue no, that you're still the same person and that your name isn't important. That's what she's saying here. But she knows that the families are enemies. And then it's a Montague. It's neither a hand, nor foot, nor arm, face, or any other part belonging to a man. What part she's talking about is up to speculation, I suppose, but she's basically saying that no physical part of you is actually a Montague. It's just a name. "Oh, some other name," she says. "What's in a name?" "That which we call a rose by any other name would smell as sweet. And that's a famous line from this play. If you learn nothing else, no other quote, then that is definitely one that you need to know. A rose by any other name would smell as sweet. I don't know. Would a rose smell as sweet if it was called a skunk cabbage? I guess we'll never know, right? But Romeo, were he not Romeo called, retain that dear perfection which he owes without that title. So Romeo, if he weren't called Romeo, basically would still be dear perfection. So she doesn't rant on about his twinkly eyes or his beautiful cheeks or his gorgeous silky hair. She doesn't go on about that. She just says, plain and simply, love Juliet, plain and simple says, dear perfection. She says Romeo, and she's addressing him even though she doesn't know he's there. Off thy name, so get rid of, and for that name which is no part of thee, take all myself. So when she says, and for that name, take all myself, she's basically offering an exchange. So she's saying, Romeo, get rid of Montague, get rid of that name, and in its place you can have me, all of me. Okay. So, and she calls him dear perfection, which is really, I think, quite sweet. Okay. Okay, so think about now the answers to these questions. What is the obstacle or problem that Juliet is talking about? And what are her solutions? So this is a good place to pause and write the answers. Try to remember, it's good practice to use a capital letter and full stops, right? Write in full sentences. Don't lose those skills as we progress through this lockdown, okay? So pause it here and write full answers to these questions. I don't believe the answer's on the next page, but basically the problem is that the Montague family and the Capulet family are enemies, like sworn bitter enemies. And her solutions are that one of them has to disown the family or change their name and essentially not become someone else, still be themselves, but have a different name. So here is a student's explanation of Romeo's soliloquy. So explaining what Romeo is talking about, and then what the student's opinion is of Romeo because of that. Romeo's use of hyperbole, so exaggeration, Romeo's use of hyperbole suggests that he has an unrealistic attitude to Juliet and their possible relationship. When he talks of heaven, stars, and angel, he shows that he is impractical. Although Romeo is very romantic and devoted, he ignores the obstacles between them and does not even think about how to overcome them. So compare this now to what you wrote before you took a break or earlier in the lesson right after we looked at Romeo's soliloquy. And have you included the same things that are on the screen here? And if not, can you add them to your answer? His use of hyperbole, the way that he suggests that she's more beautiful than stars, more bright, and so forth, create an unrealistic attitude to her. And of course, we know they meet their tragic end really early on in their relationship. So who knows if they had made it to a year, 2 years, 5 years, what would have happened to their love? Or would they have learnt all the little nitty gritty details that people learn about each other when they're together for a long time? Oh, he snores. Oh, she's, so messy. Little irritating details about others that kind of make us human. Because at the moment, he's put her up on this pedestal, which is very unrealistic. Okay? So compare your answer now to this one and make sure that you have roughly the same idea. Now, what does Juliet's soliloquy reveal about the kind of character she is? She loves Romeo, she's practical, and she's able to reason and think through problems and offer solutions. So she has that same, perhaps, unrealistic view of him, calling him dear perfection, but she's more practical. And so she thinks through what possible solutions. Arguably, would it be easy for her to change her name? Well, no, of course not. As you'll see later on, this would cause her all sorts of family problems if she doesn't do what she's told. Never mind if she changes her name, she'd be thrown out of the family. So she has several obstacles more than what she's able at the moment to realize, but she does think about the fact that they are enemies. Okay, so we have looked at the term tragic flaw. A character has a tragic flaw when what makes them so special also brings about their downfall. Juliet's tragic flaw is that she loves Romeo exceptionally passionately. How does Juliet's fatal flaw start to appear in this scene? What tells us in this scene that Juliet is a special, exceptional person? And what can we see in this scene that what is special about her might lead to her downfall? So press pause, write this title, How Does Juliet's Fatal Flaw Start to Appear in This Scene? And then use the 2 bullet points to help you, okay? So pause it now and write a response. I think I wrote, oops, I switched screens too quickly. So in order to avoid re-recording, if you pause it and just go back a little bit, you can still have the question on the screen for you, okay? So how long does that paragraph need to be? Well, as detailed as you can make it, really, based on what you've learned today, okay? So on this screen, what's in a name? That which we call a rose by any other word would smell as sweet. And then which statements about this quotation from Juliet are correct? A. Juliet recognizes that Romeo's name is an obstacle from them being together. B. Juliet thinks that Romeo's name should not matter. Who he is and how she feels about him are most important. The word rose shows Juliet comparing Romeo to a flower and suggests that she thinks Romeo is pleasant and beautiful. D, the phrase what's in a name proves that Juliet is going to give up her own name to be with Romeo. Or E, Juliet uses a rose to describe Romeo because it is red, the color of the Capulet family crest. So take time. Which one? Be careful here, because some of them sound reasonable, but then actually, if you think about it, they're not. Which statements about this quotation from Juliet are correct? Juliet recognizes that Romeo's name is an obstacle for them being together. She thinks that Romeo's name shouldn't matter. Who he is and how she feels about him are most important. The word rose shows Juliet comparing Romeo to a flower and suggests that she thinks Romeo is pleasant and beautiful. Okay, so hopefully you did the stops and starts where you were supposed to, and you've got a really good idea now of what's happening in the garden outside the Capulet, after the Capulet ball. And I'll see you in the next lesson. Bye-bye.